Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Bytes of Good Live. If you don't already know, Bytes of Good Live is a monthly speaker series hosted by Hack for Impact, and you can find all of our past live events and podcast episodes at bytesofgood.org. Today, we are joined by two social cybersecurity researchers at Carnegie Mellon University, Cori Faklaris and Tom Magelinski, and we'll be learning about cybersecurity thinking as it relates to our work with nonprofits, what is social cybersecurity, and a bit about how you can learn more about this area if you are interested. We will have a presentation from our guests first, and then we'll go into a moderated Q&A before taking questions from all of you. So as always, please feel free to send your questions in the chat throughout the event. And with that, I will pass it on to Cori and Tom.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Cori Faklaris.
I'm Tom Magelinski.
And we're here to talk about social cybersecurity and whether this might be a rewarding career for you. So we're both fourth-year PhD candidates and researchers. I'm at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Like Tom, I'm a Knight Fellow of the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity. I'm also on a special social cybersecurity project within the HCII that's funded by the National Science Foundation, and I've put our website there in case anybody is interested more about that. But I've also spent a lot of time before I went to grad school as a journalist, and then also as an IT analyst for a news organization, and then finally as a social media manager and consultant. So all that work informs the work that I do now and gives me some lived experience to draw on when I think about social cybersecurity. And I've also published some research in academia at venues such as the Usenix Symposium on Usable Privacy and Security, which has the SOUPS acronym, and we actually do eat soup when we go to the conference in person. And then also the proceedings of the ACM on human-computer interaction, with the special volume for CSCW, which stands for Computer-Supported Collaborative Work.
Thanks. The PhD program that I'm in is called Societal Computing here at CMU. And the research group that I'm a part of is called CASOS. It's the Center for Analysis of Computational, Social, and Organized Systems. Before this, I was doing my undergrad at Virginia Tech in engineering physics. So I was studying the dynamics of physical systems, and now I study the dynamics of social systems. So my work is mostly falling under network science. So I publish in network science venues and conferences. But some of the work crosses over with machine learning on graphs. So those works are kind of published in artificial intelligence and machine learning venues.
So just to give you a quick overview of what my research is, in case you have any more questions, I'd be happy to take them in the chat. So I work on what's called the human factors of cybersecurity. And so I think about end users specifically inside, a computational system. So I think about, first of all, I want to understand people. So I want to know what drives you, say, to adopt or not adopt two-factor authentication, or to click that notification to update your software. But I also think about how can we empower people? And so I think this is kind of a shift in cybersecurity. I don't think that users are a lost cause. I think that they can really help us, and also we can help them to keep themselves and their network secure through things such as creating cool tools, such as password managers or novel authentication schemes. And to bridge these two tracks of research, I'm studying both individual differences, but also social cognition, which is how we think about things when we're in social groups, as opposed to by ourselves, and also think about social contexts of use. And so my work falls into basically three types of methods. So in my empirical and observational work, if you want to click that a couple times, I will show you, I've got a couple studies that you could look up online if you're interested in, say, romantic cybersecurity, which isn't usually two words you put together, or workplace cybersecurity. That's my observational or empirical work. But then also in my theoretical and modeling work, I've created a couple different psychometric scales to try to measure people's attitudes. Also looked at how can we better model what I call cyber health, so adapting cybersecurity as a public health model. And then finally looking at how can we use people's sensor information, such as from their mobile phones, so we don't have to give them a survey. We can infer things about their security attitudes or their security intentions. And then finally, in my technical and design work, I thought about how we can create simple social nudges for security information workers. We've also created an over-the-top interface for Facebook and other similar platforms called SafeSea to help people reflect on their privacy settings. We've adapted the Plants vs. Zombies game as a game called Apps vs. Hackers to try to simulate what the defense environment is. And then finally, the last thing we've looked at is creating some sort of a social authentication tool. So say maybe you don't need a really heavy-duty password authentication scheme, multi-factor authentication, but you do want to keep people out of your stuff. Maybe we could have a Slack bot, for instance, that will ask you questions that only people within the work group would know in order to let you into the files for the group. And so I think about specifically information security, especially given my background in journalism and social media. And so we think about the CIA model specifically. This is one popular model. So that stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So first of all, you want to keep your data confidential so that unauthorized access is prevented. But then also data needs to have integrity, and that means that it can't be modified without authorized access. But none of this is really helpful to people unless it's also available. And so we can't lock data away. We have to have it be actually accessible to the people that need it. Now, and this security model has evolved over the years. There's new desired properties emerging. For instance, safety is a big one I think about. For instance, is my data protected against like maybe ex-partners or somebody who might want to access it? And then also, we don't think anymore really about security as a binary state. We think about it as more of a process or in a certain use context. So my data might be secure in the case of my workgroup files, for instance, but maybe I'm doubtful that my data is secure when I consider like my social media profiles. And then another concept, especially when you think about nonprofit design or design for social good, when you think about security design, you're really talking about threat modeling. And so when you're asking questions, when you're trying to figure out what kind of system to design or what kinds of software might be needed or use cases, you should also think about what are you trying to protect in your system? How important is it to you? Which is also going to lead into how much are you willing to spend to protect it. That's a very important consideration. And then also, you need to really think very creatively about who you might be concerned about. There's a lot of different types of threat actors out there. They range from the honest but curious, people who are pranksters. You might also, of course, have ex-partners or ex-coworkers who might wish you harm. So-called script kiddies who might be bored looking for something to mess with if they come across it. But then also more serious concerns would be cyber criminals, insider attack, maybe somebody inside your organization is trying to bring you down. And then unfortunately, there's quite a few nation state actors out there. And then also you want to think about how are they going to attack you? And that's very specific to how your system is configured. And so you can group threat approaches into two basic buckets. One is pessimistic. So in this scenario, this is when whatever you have to protect is so important, especially say you're a hospital or a bank, that you really just need to put a lot of money into it in order to prevent problems from happening. And so you might create access control systems. You might create, put up some firewalls around your data, move your data around. Data at risk is data at risk. You can also implement things like IP blocking or blacklists. Better programming tools, definitely a good investment in this kind of scenario. Better operating system. And then for your users on the end of the line, you'll need to require strong passwords or two-factor authentication, and you'll also want to invest in user training. But in the other vein is the optimistic. That's especially useful to keep in mind if it's okay to detect and just respond to problems after the fact. And so with a nonprofit, you might be tempted to go this route just because this would involve spending less money. But what you might invest in, though, is something like an intrusion detection system, maybe based in machine learning that can catch problems, people once they're inside the system. You can also rely on external authorities, of course. Say you're a social media platform, you might want content moderators to take down malicious posts after the fact, or you can always call in the FBI as a great resource. Never forget to involve them if you get a ransomware notice or something like that. And then also just keeping your end users in the loop by notifying them of strange logins or new devices that have logged on with their credentials. And so that leads into Tom's presentation.
Thanks. Thanks. So yeah, I wanted to zoom out a little bit and talk about how we can kind of define this thing, social cybersecurity, because classically it's Cori's research. It's human factors in cybersecurity. But recently, we've kind of expanded this definition to incorporate problems that are kind of quite different, and that's sort of where my research falls under. So this is one definition that I like to kind of use for this other side of social cybersecurity, which is saying it's the area of trying to characterize and understand cyber-mediated changes in human behavior and in socio-political and cultural outcomes. So when I think about social cybersecurity, we have the one arm of things where we have the social context in which cybersecure behaviors are influenced and how the social norms are changed. And then we have this other arm, which is concerned of questions where people are manipulating individuals or they're manipulating groups using cyber infrastructure, but their goal is to have some sort of socio-political or cultural consequence. So this is quite different from a typical cybersecurity problem when you're attacking on or through cyber infrastructure, where you're mostly trying to either steal or destroy information or technology or money. So one example that I like to use to kind of show what cybersecurity, social cybersecurity can be, is Russia's efforts to promote anti-vaccination sentiments in the United States. This can be seen as a social cybersecurity problem because they are using social media to manipulate users, individuals, and groups to distrust vaccinations. And their goal, they're having this kind of larger socio-political cultural goal of undermining trust in our scientific institutions and to some extent undermining public health. So these are the kind of questions that social media is playing a big part in, and more generally, cyber infrastructure is playing a big part in. So it's a kind of a different type of social cybersecurity. So the research group that I'm a part of is mostly interested in creating tools that we can use to better understand the information space so that we can try to answer some of the questions that we have in this area. So some of these tools might look like detectors for automated accounts or bots, or detectors for coordinated accounts. Basically, all of the things that you can use to feed in raw social media data and get out something that you can better interpret to understand what's going on in that specific conversation. So my little corner of this problem is in social network dynamics and social community dynamics. where we are connecting all the users that are interacting directly into a social network, and then building and using algorithms to answer key questions about this structure, which people are important, how people are connecting, what is the group structure or the community structure of these different conversations. So the three questions that I'm mostly interested in are how do we detect changes in group structure? And how do we interpret the changes once we see them? And then given the context, what are the implications of the changes that we are seeing in these communities online? So I know that sounds pretty abstract and kind of disconnected to social cybersecurity, but understanding communities and their change at a deep level is really fundamental for a lot of the questions that we have on this side of things. So one example that gets talked about a lot is bots or automated accounts online. And there's a lot of work to kind of detect which users on Twitter, for example, are automated. And that's a great first step. We have to know which users are automated. But to answer some of the bigger questions, like what are the impact that bots are having, we have to really understand their interplay with communities. Are bots all just talking to themselves, or are they embedded in these rich connections with non-bot users? Those are two very different things and would have a lot of different implications for how big the bot problem really is. And that kind of continues when we think about dynamics of communities, especially when we think about influence, because influence is usually kind of portrayed through how community structure has changed and what communities talk about kind of over time. So there's a lot of examples like this. I'll just do one more. Polarization is a big topic on social media, especially, and this is inherently a group problem. You have to be polarized with respect to another group. So it's important, if we want to answer a question like, are we getting more or less polarized? We have to have strong definitions and ways of uncovering the groups themselves and how they're changing through time. So there's all sorts of interesting questions and very hard questions in this arm of things that some of which I've worked on and many more that I have not worked on. But I'd be happy to talk more about that in any questions that we may have. But with that, I think our next slide is just some resources that you might be interested in using if you're interested in using cybersecurity for your own work.
It's amazing. Thank you guys so much for this amazing presentation. Just stop sharing my screen for a bit and we can go into some questions. Great. So just to begin, we have heard a bit about your work in cybersecurity and a bit about your journey into cybersecurity as professionals. And so just to kick us off with the first question, how would you describe a day in the life of a cybersecurity researcher?
Well, I'll go first. I think because I'm really a design researcher at heart, my work is somewhat similar to the work of other design researchers or user experience researchers. I tend to follow like a 5-step process. You could say that other designers also follow in industry, where first I want to explore a topic space or a problem space. And then once I start exploring it, then I start to try to define what are the needs, what is working well and what's not working well. So that's going to help me start to look at where can I make an impact. So for cybersecurity, this process looked like, in the case of romantic cybersecurity, another design student or design-oriented researcher was asking people about their cybersecurity behaviors, and people mentioned that they were often sharing their passwords with their significant other or their spouse. And so that started us thinking, most accounts are designed for one individual user, and they presume that that user maps to one individual account. But this seems to not, I mean, there seems to be some workarounds going on with romantic couples. And so that led us to start exploring that space further and talking more in more detail about with people who are parts of couples. In fact, we did a series of interview studies with couples together talking about, so tell us more about, tell us some stories around like what accounts you share and why, and maybe privately, we would also ask, what accounts do you not share and why? So we can start to understand, you know, what's going on, why are people doing these things? And so then we can start also looking at how, or surveying like what kinds of authentication schemes are there out there. And so then as a designer, you would then start brainstorming ideas and then start creating some prototypes or proof of concept systems so that you can test those, such as, you know, there are some schemes out there such as Netflix or Amazon Prime. There's one account, but you can pick different user profiles to activate when you log in. So we use those as kind of a starting point. Those are design patterns is what they call them, that people have already encountered, and it makes it much easier to design solutions. You don't have to really teach people how to use those. And so then once we create a prototype, then you can evaluate them with a target audience. And then you learn a lot. And so then you iterate, you go back and you refine it and see if that helps. And with cybersecurity, there is, as I mentioned earlier, this whole process, you also have to think about threat modeling, like not just with the end users or the company or the type of system, but who's likely to want to break into that? Who's the threat? Should we design anything specific in there? Or when we test it, do we want to test it against with what's called penetration testing? So just see is it possible to defeat our design. So that I actually find that cycle quite fun. And then in academia, it's also very important, just like in industry. It's not enough to do the work, you have to tell people about it. You have to get it out into the world. So Tom and I both have published papers, but also have given talks like this to try to get our work out of the lab and into the hands of the people who can use it.
So on my side of things, or at least in my lab, a lot of the students are focused less on kind of tool building and more on kind of deep dives into different case studies and different like specific questions on social media. So to kind of facilitate that, we have pipelines that basically any kind of social media data you might be interested in, you'll probably feed through this pipeline and try to understand, you know, who are the important actors, what is the group structure, how it's changing, how many bots are in them. So for the people doing that sort of work, you spend a lot of time thinking about what events you're interested in and what specific questions you are interested in social media. And then you set up collections to actually get this data. And then you kind of feed it through the pipeline and you do deeper dives to kind of see what's really going on. So a natural kind of product of this workflow is that the most interesting thing is happening like right now. So like all the time, there's some major event that's happening that you really want to understand. So you spend some time with these like longer analysis where you might be collecting data for a very long time leading up to an election or something. And then you'll have these quick events where, like some politician is coming to Pittsburgh tomorrow, like we want to collect and set up a collection tomorrow so that we can kind of set up our analysis long down the road. So that's kind of like one sort of workflow that we see in my group. And the other, which is on my side of things, is a bit more like what Cori was talking about, where we're designing the different things that might go into that pipeline. So we're taking a look at that pipeline, we're saying, okay, like people are having a hard time understanding the topics that people are talking about in social media, or we don't have fine enough resolution on that. So a good research project for me then would be, how can we build a better tool to extract topics or something? And then, so it's a lot of reading and kind of iterating on the tools that we have and the tools that exist on the literature. And then once we're successful and on top of doing like publications and talks, we kind of work it into our existing pipeline so that more people can use them for different case studies and other things like that.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I know hearing from the work that you guys do within cybersecurity, it's obvious you guys kind of represent a relatively large group of cybersecurity specializations. And we'd love to hear, maybe, I know we heard a little bit in this last question about some of the work you guys do, but could we maybe hear a little bit more about maybe your favorite impactful cybersecurity research project that you've worked on?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I think one thing I actually really enjoyed working on was the romantic cybersecurity work, even though I'm not necessarily focusing on it right now, just because I think it tapped into like how people are making compromises with security infrastructure because of their social needs in their lives, but they still want to be secure. And so I followed that up. I've talked with people via online surveys and then also in interviews in workplaces. This is probably all of us on listening to this or on this call can think of people around us who might have a sticky note with their password taped, someplace, that's protecting an account that's actually containing what might be some very sensitive data or useful data to somebody who's not authorized. But, so those are compromises we make because, we work in teams and maybe we're not all in the same place. And now that we're not even in person, maybe now we're passing these passwords back and forth in messaging apps where really they're not secure. And that's also a concern, but sometimes we make compromises in order to get our jobs done. And I think that's also led me now for my dissertation, I'm looking at creating a stage model, like a model of the stages of change or the stages of behavior adoption. So thinking about what leads people, say, to do or not do what is recommended by experts for cybersecurity, but also incorporating, do they even know what is recommended by experts? Because I think that's another big issue. And I think this has the potential for a big impact because cybersecurity is very expensive, and yet we're falling behind. McAfee, in a report last year, estimated that the costs of cybercrime had gone up more than 50% in the 2-year period leading up to 2020, and that that the costs would top $1 trillion. And certainly not all of that might come down to the human factors work that I do or the social network work that Tom does, but certainly those are big pieces of it because frankly, encryption is really good now when people implement it. There's techniques such as adversarial machine learning that are really good, and so people are really the most easily attacked part of the network or the system. So actually, I'm really excited by my work because I think I have the potential to make a big impact on that.
Yeah, one of the projects that I'm most excited on right now is one that's still in progress, and I showed one picture of it in my slides. But we're looking at how we can detect coordinated accounts on Twitter. And I think this is a really important problem because as much as bots and automated accounts are a big problem, a lot of times if you're on Twitter, you're scrolling Twitter, you see a weird account and you can kind of identify that this looks kind of weird. I think that this is probably a bot. But when you have coordinated accounts, you might have one account that is actually human, and then a bunch of accounts which are tweeting the same thing as if it's from a different account, all at the same time. So if you were to look at this user's profile, they look like a regular human because they're being tweeted by a regular human. It's just kind of blasted from all these different angles to kind of create this like false sense of a majority or a group kind of pushing this kind of thing. So I think that this is a super interesting question, and there's a bunch of ways that you could define coordination, but we're specifically looking at synchronization. So people who are, or users which are kind of pushing the same message at the same time. And it's also kind of hard just computationally, because you can't really compare what one account is doing to what everyone else is doing and get like a similarity. It's going to be too expensive for really big data. So what we've chosen to do is we can like define a set of actions that you can take. Like you might be tweeting URLs or tweeting hashtags or mentioning certain people, but you can kind of list the types of actions that you're allowed to take. And then we've come up with a method that can find at scale the users that are doing these certain messages or these certain actions at the same time, and we can draw connections between them. So this gives us the like coordination network that I showed in that slide, and we can apply grouping algorithms to see communities of users that are highly synchronized, and so we can detect these kind of groups of coordinated users. So I think it's a really kind of cool approach that ties a couple different things that I'm interested in together. And we've applied it to the conversation surrounding the Reopen America protests. And we have found some kind of interesting groups of users that that are coordinating to push users to actually like go out and protest the COVID restrictions that we had over the summer. So it's still a work in progress. So we don't have a paper to point to or other talks or anything, but it's something I'm definitely excited about.
That's really interesting to hear about. Yeah, I know sometimes within cybersecurity, people maybe hear about it and it seems very big and scary when it comes to technology as a whole. But I guess within the types of things that you guys have looked into and done research on, what would you say are the scariest things within the cybersecurity field that maybe you have come across or see down the road?
I mean, to me, I actually think it's really scary how prevalent ransomware is right now. This is like the #1 thing, like when people talk to my advisors or even to me, they want to know, what can I do about ransomware? And I think, thinking about nonprofits, it's a concern for everybody across the board, whether you're a small, medium-sized organization, or particularly, of course, if you're a large organization. This is becoming, it seems like, an epidemic. I'm not exactly sure why. There's an article this month in Communications of the Association of Computing Machinery that does talk about like maybe organizations aren't hiring the right cybersecurity people, or just aren't paying for methods such as encryption, the newest encryption algorithms, or really considering even that their data might be at risk and they need to take some steps to implement ways to move it around or create other defenses that we know can work to protect data from these cyber criminals. All this stuff is above my head, like some of it. I am only really focused on my one niche, but the ransomware piece does really scare me.
Yeah, on the kind of social media side, I think one big kind of threat is the rise of deepfakes. It's not so much of a problem right now, and we do have good tools for at least computationally like detecting deepfakes and just like taking them down automatically. But I think it's definitely still a concern, especially because if if we kind of lose the ability to detect them as well, it's very hard to kind of take the information back. Once someone has seen a video of something happening, you can tell them that it wasn't real, but it does have a kind of a lasting effect, and you can do all sorts of kind of nasty stuff in terms of threats with that sort of technology. So I think that's probably I think the scariest thing on the threat side. And then more kind of on like the institutional side, I think it is kind of scary that so much, well, it's kind of scary both ways. Like right now we have such a concentration of power within the social media companies, and they're kind of, their profit motives are kind of pushing content which is also closely kind of related to this kind of problematic content. But at the same time, once users are leaving for other platforms, we have platforms which are completely like unexperienced in terms of regulation, moderation. They definitely have less tools for things like deepfakes and stuff. So I think there's kind of problems on both sides in that respect.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. Sort of switching gears away from the industry, how in general would you think, or rather, why would you say cybersecurity thinking is important or relevant to the way that we live our lives in the 21st century?
You know, I think we just can't be naive about the risks as well as the benefits of basically computing pervading every aspect of our lives now in the Western world, at least. I think there's a lot of challenges and opportunities because we are a society in which so much data is collected and also stored that pertains to us, and sometimes we don't even realize it. I think that is a big challenge that we're trying now just to grapple with and start to try to think about what can be done to resolve some of the dilemmas that this poses. I also think cybersecurity thinking is important because it's foundational for a lot of other things. So unless your system is secure or your organization is secure, you can't also establish other things that are important, such as privacy. You also need security for the flip side, for disclosure, because you can only really disclose and be public and create outreach if you have the security aspect locked down, where you know that you have control and agency over your assets and over other parts of the organization that are really valuable to you, or that's valuable to your household or to your professional life or something like that. So I think it's something that hopefully in my work, in my career, I can help boost cybersecurity awareness and also try to help people think through why or why not to engage with certain things online, or why not to adopt certain technologies such as password managers, or like I've enabled two-factor authentication for my Twitter account, for instance, just because I've realized that it would just be super bad if somebody tried to impersonate me on Twitter. So yeah, you do have to have an interesting mix of paranoia, but also curiosity. And there's it's not something that many people have naturally, that combination, but I think these are both useful traits as you for people who are increasingly surrounded by computation and by computer systems.
Yeah, I really just want to echo Cori's point about just it's really worthwhile to think about and try to understand the level of data that is being collected about you all the time. And I think that spending the time to think about that will both impact like how important you think that your cybersecurity is. Like think about what could be done with the access to all of that data that's being collected. And it also affects how you think about the other side of things too. Like if whether it be corporations or other actors that have all of this information about me, like how can I be manipulated using that information? You know, like the tweet that I'm being served, where is this coming from, and like what information is this kind of being based off of? I think that just trying to grapple with the volume of information collected about you, combined with the really sophisticated algorithms for leveraging that data, is really important.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think a really important part of this sort of conversation is, well, yes, talking about how users can consume, more aware of the type of data that they're giving up. It's also important to think about it from the developer's point of view. And I know with Hack for Impact, we have a bunch of people who have skill sets in development and design, creating software for nonprofits. And keeping these things in mind is really important. So with that in mind, what sort of things within cybersecurity thinking should developers or designers of web products, app products, et cetera, keep in mind when they're developing these things?
Well, I think one important thing is simply really creating yourself or using a platform that has very solid authentication for users of that platform, and also for securing the data that's collected through that service or that software or whatever you're designing and developing. And I know, I know this. There's a fellow PhD student at HCI, Tianqi Li. She looks into how developers think about privacy, and so she's found that there's a lot of unawareness and also confusion. And then sometimes the fact is designers, developers are on a deadline. They're cobbling together code maybe. They're trying to work through bugs or reason through why this or that doesn't work. Security and privacy might be a secondary consideration just to getting the job done. And that's just a reality of life. Sometimes you have to compromise on things, but I would hope that people wouldn't compromise on security and privacy. I think that's from where I stand, that seems like a huge challenge, but I'm not a developer personally. So but that's what I see from my standpoint.
Yeah, I'm not much of a developer or really designer either, but I think two things that are really important to think about are content moderation. Anytime you have user-generated content, you're going to run into the content moderation problem eventually. I think companies are starting to see that now in spaces that are typically less moderated, things like Clubhouse or platforms hosting podcasts. There's been less kind of emphasis on content moderation for these kind of mediums, but it's going to be more and more important going forward. And the other thing I would say kind of for developers is to really consider what you're maximizing on when you are building like machine learning models, especially for kind of serving user content. It's really important to understand what sort of information you're leveraging and what the impacts are going to be long term when you're serving users that kind of content, and what kind of content that is encouraging users to make as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Now, we are running a little bit low on time, so before we get to our audience questions, I have one last question for you guys. So for our audience of students, many are trying to figure out what's next for them after undergrad. And for students that are maybe interested in cybersecurity or even just other academic fields, how would you describe the difference between cybersecurity opportunities in the industry versus in academia as you guys work in?
I mean, from my standpoint, they're both really great. There are so many more jobs in cybersecurity than there are qualified applicants or people who even apply for them. And then in academia too, a lot of graduate school positions are driven by funding. And there's luckily a lot of funding for cybersecurity research. So I would, you know, especially we are trying to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in cybersecurity. So definitely, I think if you're in a non-traditional category for this kind of work, there are scholarships and there are also some apprenticeships available specifically for certain types of people. So definitely Google those.
Yeah, also along those lines, I know I didn't know this when I was in undergrad, but if you do a PhD, you get paid and you don't have to pay for tuition. So a lot of people are worried, you know, like I'm going to spend 5 or 6 years in school. Like I can't imagine all the additional debt that I'm going to take on and all the income that I'm not going to take for those years. So you do actually get paid. And so that does kind of help in that respect too. But yeah, I think that the opportunities are really good in both academia and industry, and especially for social cybersecurity, they're really expanding. You know, this is going to continue to be a really important problem, and people are paying more and more attention to it. So I think it's a really good area to get into, and there's such a diverse range of problems that you should never think to yourself, oh, I'm not going to be qualified to be able to get into this field, because there's people doing very qualitative work, just like doing interviews and understanding people's experiences. There are designers, there are people who are really just doing math on problems that are important. So there's a really, really broad spectrum, both in industry and academia, for kind of anyone who is interested.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. I guess we can go up now to our audience questions. So we can see. All right, so for our first question, are nonprofit projects usually targets for cyber criminals?
Well, my perception is that anybody can be a target for a cyber criminal, any organization. But I think it goes back to threat modeling if you're involved with a nonprofit. So you think about who might want to do you harm, and also what do you have that's valuable that somebody might want to steal. So thinking about cyber criminals, that's pretty much theft, right? So think about, like, do you maintain like a database of names, addresses, phone numbers, maybe also estimates of how much money they might have to donate? That's valuable information that somebody might want to steal. But the flip side is too, like, who might want to defeat your mission? Who might want to troll you or prank you and like take down your website with denial of service attacks, or attack your social media by flooding it with spam or with hateful speech. So that I'd say, like, that would determine, if you're involved with a nonprofit, how you would approach that.
All right, so let's see, our next question. What are some things within the cybersecurity field that you're excited to see in the future? With this question, yeah.
One thing that I'm excited about is there's growing interest in social cybersecurity for kind of in the nonprofit space. And it's really exciting to me to see kind of research labs and organizations like one of them is called Graphica. And it's exciting to me to see these institutions which have funding and they can do this important research, and they're also not tied to the kind of social media companies themselves. So it gives them a bit more freedom in what they can kind of types of problems that they can look at. And so I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I do think like the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts I mentioned earlier, to me that's super exciting because we all need to bring the richness of our lived experiences to bear, just to broaden our imagination about what are the threats that we need to solve for, and how can we go about that. And so, for instance, I belong to an organization called Women in Cybersecurity. And then on Twitter, I've been following a movement called Share the Mic, where established cybersecurity professionals are sharing speaking platforms with up-and-coming researchers who might be Black or from other minorities. And it's just been so cool to see so many different perspectives and also so many brilliant people coming into the field. And you know, I think it really changes like the stereotypes of who the cybersecurity professional might be, which is really great to see.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much for speaking with us today. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but again, I'm so appreciative to have you guys here. And thank you so much to everyone watching who attended our event. If you're interested in the slides or hearing more from these speakers, we'll make sure to send out that information. And we'll be hosting speakers monthly, but if you can't wait until our next event, our next Bytes of Good Live event, we also have a Bytes of Good podcast. And if you're interested, you can check that out at bytesofgood.org. Finally, just thank you everyone who came. Thank you so much to our amazing speakers, and we can't wait to have you back again next month.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.